I just want to assure you that scripture that Grace just read about Jesus has come not to bring peace, but to bring a sword, to pit family against family and brothers and sisters against one another. When that scripture was chosen, I didn't know that my sisters would be here in church today. So Kathy, Melanie, my sisters, my brother-in-law Jason, and my nephew Nathan. Didn't know they'd be in church when I picked that particular scripture, so I just want to get that out of the way right now. On December 16th, 1773, subjects of the British Empire who had enough of unfair oppression gathered at Old South Congregational Church, now United Church of Christ. They disguised themselves, finalized their plan, and went to Boston Harbor to engage in an act of protest. Perhaps the first major act of civil disobedience by the colonists towards their imperial masters, and the first of many acts of protest by the United Church of Christ. These United Church of Christ ancestors boarded British ships, anchored in Boston Harbor, and destroyed shipments of tea, dumping 342 shipping containers of tea overboard, 90,000 pounds of tea, at an estimated cost of $1.7 million. The motivation behind this act of protest was unfair taxation of the American colonists brought about by a British economic crisis. Most people don't realize that what we call the French and Indian War, which was from 1754 to 1763, directly caused the American Revolution because of the economic crisis that happened to the British Empire. During this war, the colonists fought with the British because we were British subjects, after all. But when the war ended, Great Britain found themselves economically impoverished. So much money had been used to fight the French that their economy was depleted. And so to recoup their expenses, they turned to the colonies. The British enacted a series of unjust, oppressive sanctions against the colonies to recover the money that was lost. They knew the colonists loved the written word, so they began the Stamp Act, which said that all printed materials, anything published, must be printed on a paper produced in London, embossed with a tax stamp on the crown. This stamp brought revenue to England while draining the colonists. Outrage was the consensus, and the Stamp Act was repealed. But eventually, the British came up with the Tea Act of 1773. Colonists loved their tea, so in order to regain this revenue, the British levied a high tax on tea imports. There were other economic factors at play as well, including an attempt by Britain to prop up the failing British East India Tea Company by excusing them from the provisions of the Tea Act. But the result is what matters. The colonists saw this as oppression and mobilized against the crown, protesting injustice using extreme and inflammatory measures. I don't think many of us realize the sacrifice those colonial rebels embraced as they fought for freedom from British oppression. In 1773, when things were really beginning to heat up and this first act of civil disobedience originated in a UCC church, American colonists identified themselves not as Americans, but as British. Just a generation earlier, their fathers and their brothers fought alongside the British in the French and Indian War. The Union Jack flew from every pub in New England, and the idea that they were British subjects was fundamental to who they were, to their very identity. They weren't Americans, they were British subjects. And now you have these radicals like Sam Adams, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. You see when I said John Adams, I looked over there where he usually sits. That was different John Adams. We're suggesting they had to undermine the very essence of who they were. Sons had to stand up against their fathers. Brothers had to stand up against each other. Sisters against mothers. Sisters against sisters. Nieces had to stand up to their uncles and protest the way things had always been, in favor of embracing the way things could be. And families became unhinged. I come not to bring peace, but to bring a sword. Standing up for what is right in the world sometimes creates division. That's what Jesus is talking about in this rather awkward gospel lesson today. There are times in our lives when standing up for what is right means creating division within your own family, within your circle of friends, and certainly within your church. But Jesus tells us that his way is not the easy way of appeasement, but his way is the way of controversy and division. To Jesus, peace does not mean just sticking your head in the sand and pretending everything will be fine if you just ignore it. To Jesus, peace comes when people of faith stand up against oppression, fighting the status quo and envisioning a better way of life that things could be. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. These are difficult words to hear from the Prince of Peace. But consider the situation in which Jesus lived. The Jewish faith of Jesus' time was one that had become corrupt and controlled and complicit with the establishment. Religious leaders in Jesus' day used faith to threaten and abuse others, the way people today often use the Bible to threaten and abuse others. Jesus, knowing that all people are worthy no matter how God created them, stood up to the religious leaders and proclaimed the righteousness and justice of God's kingdom. This was divisive and revolutionary. This was not the way things had always been. This was a challenge to the leadership, and they fought back. Fathers and mothers told sons and daughters, "Don't follow Jesus. He is causing dissension." Remember also that the Jewish people were enjoying a very tenuous peace with their Roman occupiers. When Romans took over a country, they forced that country to worship Roman gods. Thanks to a deal with the Jewish leadership about a generation earlier, the Jewish people were given special dispensation to not worship the Roman gods, but instead worship the one true God, the God that we worship today. But that peace and that agreement was very unstable. Any trouble caused by a dissident group or a radical rabbi could cause the Romans to withdraw that special dispensation and disallow their worship of God and force them to worship Roman gods. Fathers and mothers and told sons and daughters that perhaps it was best to not cause trouble. Perhaps it was best to not shake the boat. If we make the Romans mad, we might suffer because of it. But Jesus was not one to stick his head in the sand. Instead, he stuck his neck out. He was the Prince of Peace, but he was also the Son of Righteousness. And it is not right to allow oppression to continue. Embracing the same identity of the prophets who spoke out before him, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, and others, he stood against the injustices of the world and brought a sword of righteousness to the mandates of oppression. He fought for freedom using words as his sword, dividing fathers against sons, daughters against mothers, and so on, all in the cause of justice, righteousness, and a vision of true peace that moves beyond simple appeasement. In that same vein, our colonial ancestors were similarly diverse, fighting for freedom, even when it pitted themselves against their own family. Today we celebrate the achievements of those colonial ancestors and proclaim our embrace of the independence they held so dear and the courage they had to make choices against their culture, choices against their family, choices for Jesus, for freedom. So what are we to do now, 241 years into this great social experiment that is democracy? Are we to embrace the false memory of the way things always used to be, attempting to return to some yesteryear fantasy that never really did exist to try to bring out a false sense of peace that is built on the oppression of others? Or do we stand up for what is right and just in the world, even when it is divisive? Do we really believe in justice for all as our colonial ancestors did? Or do we believe in justice only when it is comforting our own fears? When I was growing up, the pastor who confirmed me, taught me that true freedom is the right to choose your own slavery. I even remember a sermon he preached on this topic when I was in confirmation class, filling out worship sheets like our confirmation students do here today. His sermon title was Choosing Your Own Slavery. And that was the basis for his sermon, that true freedom means you have the freedom to choose your enslavement. Now, I have to say, 30 years later or so, I really don't like using the word slavery. It brings to mind hateful images of the blight of the enslavement of black people that our country endured in our past. So I would like to change his sermon thesis a bit and suggest that freedom is the right to choose whom you will serve. True freedom is freedom from serving what you do not wish to serve, and the choice to serve that which you do serve. We have freedom in this country, but freedom from what? Freedom for what? I think the basis of our freedom, for now anyway, is the basis to choose whom we will serve. We can choose to serve fear. This specter of fear is within all of us and causes us to react violently in word or deed against others who are not like us. Serving fear is what causes people to react with hatred towards police officers and attack them violently. Serving fear is what causes people to have shootings at ball games and in schools. Serving fear is what causes people to put unjust and hateful accusations on social media. Serving fear causes people to react in ways that make them feel like they are part of a group because they are united in oppression against something else. God's other children whom they have chosen to fear. Serving fear would not be the choice Jesus would advocate. We can also serve ourselves. Now, self-service sounds great at a buffet, but self-service is not what the gospel is about. We live in a world that is very self-serving, and one of the ways we see that is the way we communicate. The tools of communication we have at our disposal have not become means of communicating, but means to squelch true communication. Remember at one time when the phone would ring and you picked it up and you didn't know who was going to be on the other end, but you had to talk to them. Now we see who is calling before we answer, and if we choose to avoid them, we do. But who actually calls anymore? We choose to text one another instead of talking without having to have a conversation with another person. Our needs are met, and that's what matters. We can serve the culture of the world, and that often happens when we choose other things over God. Service, worship, praise, and study of God's word are second to whatever other commitments society throws our way. Our schedules are too busy for God because of all the pressures our culture places upon us. I had somebody tell me earlier this year that they are so busy with all their commitments during the week that on Sundays they simply do not have time to worship God. I think they've made their choice whom they will serve. I've said many times, and I think it's in the bulletin this week, if you try to fit God into your life, you will never have time for God. But if you try to fit your life into God, you will always have time for what matters. Meaning, if you put God first, and God's mandate for love, justice, righteousness, and shalom first, then you will have plenty of time for what matters in life. I know many people are frustrated with their schedules and how many things they have to do. Managing your schedule is simple. If you schedule God first, then everything else will fall into place. And the things you don't have time for, you will find are masters that you really didn't want to serve anyway. When you serve Christ first and choose God over culture and self and fear, then everything else simply works. 1,200 years before Jesus, Joshua faced a similarly divisive situation. Taking over leadership of the Israelites from Moses, Joshua found that there was much division among the people about which way they would go, which God they will serve, and which direction they would take. Joshua chapter 24 verse 15 makes it clear as he tells the people, serve God in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, then choose for yourselves who you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So what is freedom all about? Freedom is the right to choose whom you will serve. In today's world, as well as Joshua's world, as well as Jesus' world, there are many competing gods within ourselves and within culture. Most of them are not the God of Jesus. Choosing to serve God is often divisive. But the joy of discipleship is well worth the cost of discipleship. Choose today whom you will serve. But as for me, I will serve God. Amen.